why the organization is, significant, why it's important, and so on. So, and I do understand that hesitation, right? Okay, so that's one thing. But and there is generally more familiarity with other organizations like NATO. You've examined it. If you've done like IR, intro to IR and things like that, you definitely would have looked at things like NATO and IMF and so on, right? So I do understand the level of familiarity. That's it, all right, okay? To why I think this topic is important, like which I've mentioned before, right? When I talked about the EU, right, is that you could get three different types of questions on OAU and AU, right? On this chapter, right? That means lecture 17 and 18. You could get three different types of questions, right? First type of question would be the standard type of question that assesses. Maybe I'll write this down so that you can make your decisions yourself and how you want to approach revising the topic. Okay, so that would be how I'm approaching the material. Okay, right. sorry. sorry. Okay, so first one, right? The first type of question is your typical kind of question that is on the organization per se. Meaning, right, you could get a question that specifically tests you on, say, the OAU and the AU. Okay, the kinds of questions that could come out for this category, right, would be questions that ask you, number one, about the impact of the OAU and the AU, right, on development, on regional cooperation, on progression, right, in the African continent. All right. Another type of question that can come out in this category could be the assessment of the organization per se. That means like an evolutionary assessment, looking at OAU, right, and then looking at how it transitioned into the AU. And then an evaluation to say whether you think this organization is successful, is effective, right? Is it, an effective international organization? Is it an effective regional organization, and so on, right? So that means assessing the OAU and AU, right, as it is, right? Okay, so you could look at it in terms of what does if that means if you're just only looking at the OAU and AU, right? Okay, you can look at it in terms of what does it represent, right? Okay, so does it represent like an African identity? Does it represent values associated with what the African states embody, right? Is it successful or unsuccessful because of the kind of organizing principle that is in the African continent, right? Sovereignty is an organizing principle in the African continent, right? If you look at African International Society, that means just looking at Africa, all right? Okay, you could get questions that are like that. Okay, all right. Or thematically, right? What are the contributions that the OAU and the AU have made to states? So you could look at it in terms of economic contributions, political contributions, diplomatic contributions, right? Has it helped to increase level of cooperation among states? Has it contributed to maybe helping to create a platform, right, where these states, which are of differing, uneven capacities, come together to cooperate, right, to solve problems that confound them? Because in the African continent, we've got some states who've got very, strong hard power. Some states who've got very, strong soft power. Some states which are in the least developing categories. right? Some states that exhibit, signs of progression, right? So as an organization, as a regional organization, right, has it contributed, to this, right? You can look at it from, say, for example, I do not know whether a lot. I mean, you should remember, and I do mention it. I do mention it. Yeah, I remember. I do mention it here in this chapter. I added it on. You remember the English school? Do you remember English school theory, all right, from IR? Okay, the intro to IR, right? Remember English school. And then you've got Barry Buzan, right, who talks about the logic of the pan of fried eggs. I don't know whether you remember that. I have that for you down here, right? Okay, the pan of fried eggs. And you have the pan of fried eggs, and you have the logic of the egg yolk and the egg white, all right? And then the logic about, how the egg yolks, the thicker, the thicker part of the eggs, right, is the egg yolk, right? And the egg yolk represents regional organizations or regional relationships, whereas the thinner egg white represents global relationships because of, whether increased or decreased interaction, increased shared experiences, the repeated institutions and so on, right? I go through that. So, applying the theories, right? Like, realism, if you apply realism to examining OAU and AU, right? Is cooperation affected because states are wearing their realist lenses, right? Or on the contrary, right? Can we use the pan of fried eggs from English school, right? Although English school is not, something that we examine per se in this course, right? I still think you could use it because we're talking about regional organizations, right? And I talked a little bit in this chapter. I added on this discussion about regionalism, right, which I think is necessary, right? So you can still bring in the logic of English school. I do not think that you penalize. I think in fact that is a useful angle, useful angle of analysis, right? Okay, so that is the first. Sorry. That is the first category of questions that you can get on this topic, right? So that means questions that are asking you specifically about the OAU and the AU. For that purpose, right, because you would require a background on Africa, I have given you, right, if you've seen your notes already, right, I've given you a background, right, additional that is not in your subject guide, right? So I pulled out a couple of things from a couple of places and put it into your subject, into your lecture notes so that you have a requisite background. If you do not have a background, as in if you do not provide a background, or you don't have an understanding about the dynamics, right, within the region, associated with things like regionalism, associated with things like the inherent characteristics of the region, associated nationality, the logic of the scramble for Africa and decolonization, the logic about governance, institutions, and so on. Right? Okay. At least some level of understanding would be necessary. Just like how you would have to have some level of understanding of what happened during World War II or prior to that, and how that fueled, right, the need and the want to prevent any kind of conflict, right, in the European region, right, and that is why the EU represents, European values of democracy. It represents the idea of cooperation and so on, right? So just like how you needed that discussion, you would need this discussion for Africa, and I can assure you, right, that the background discussion, right, is actually not difficult, right? Once you read the material, right, you just have a basic grasp of certain characteristics of the region, right, you should be fine. Okay, so the logic of the cleavages and so on, right, that basically is something that is easy to grasp. It's not something that is so complicated or complex, right? Okay, so that is the first category of questions. Second category of questions, right, okay, would be the kind of questions that compare uh, EU, right, European Union to African Union, all right? That means questions that are basically asking you to say, to assess, for example, right, if the AU or the OAU, right, was modeled after the success, right, of regional organizations such as the European Union. Okay, do we see that level of progression? Why not? Right? Okay, So the rationale is that what is it that worked in the EU, right? That was proven to be a stumbling block for the AU, right? Okay, what is it that what are the inherent characteristics, right, of the European region, right, that represent a particular political and policy context that suggests that the dynamics and the characteristics of what we see in the European Union is not something that we can replicate easily or replicate at all, right, in another region. And the AU, the African Union, OAU and African Union, right? OAU is the first iteration, Organization for African Unity. Subsequent iteration, which is the current one, is AU, right? So OAU and AU, all right, okay? So, what is it about the political and policy context, right, that we see that is unique to the EU? We already know that it's unique, that the EU is unique, right? And that, whatever we see there is not something that can be replicated easily, right? Because of the characteristics of the states, because of their prior history, because of the unique circumstances under which, it actually was formed, right? And how the EU, right, is basically an organization that is, the type that says never say die. All right. No matter what kind, please don't use that phrase. All right. Okay. But no matter what kind of troubles that the EU has faced over the years, it has always managed to find, a way to rise above the occasion. Right. Okay. Hit rock bottom in the 1970s. Subsequently, how did it climb back up again? Right. And those unique circumstances, right? And I don't want to keep using the word unique, right? So that's why I use the word political and policy context, right? So that particular political and policy context, the inherent characteristics, right, of that region is not something that you can replicate elsewhere. And that is where you get the comparison between EU and OAU, right? Okay. So you could get that type of question that asks you to compare. My concern, right, is that if that is, you got 12 questions in your exam, right? My concern is that if you get only one question on the EU, right, and that's what you prepped for, and it so happened that that one question on the EU comes out, partner with the AU, right? So that is the concern. So that's why I would say, have at least, an understanding of what the AU represents. You can tilt your answer more towards the EU for that purpose, right? That means that means your answer is basically, the bulk of your answer would basically be, although it's comparative, the bulk of your answer is basically explaining what are the characteristics, what are the features of, the EU, right? And then how that compares to the AU, right? So you could get a question in that category. Of course, you cannot write a totally one-sided answer with one measly little diet paragraph of the AU, right? And then bulk of the answer on EU for a comparison. That's not going to work either, right? So that would be the second category of questions, right? The comparison between OAU slash AU and the EU, right? Okay. The third kind of question that you could get, a third category of question that you could get, right, would be the kind of question that is the open-ended question. Just the kinds of question that ask you, right, what is the contribution of regional organizations? Do regional organizations have any value? Do they make any real contribution, right, to the development, the progress, economic, political, diplomatic, aspects of progress, right, to the region? Are regional organizations, right, say for example, do they help or hinder, right, how states function, perform, right? What are the characteristics of regional organizations? Because remember, we looked at role and function of IOs, correct? Okay, so that means you're applying the logic of, the role and function of IOs, which we looked at in lecture 1 and lecture 5 in particular, right? And you're looking at, the role and function of IOs. That means the technical aspect, right, of the role and function of IOs, and applying them to the logic of regional organizations, right? You could, get a question that is, asking you, what is, right, regionalism, for instance, right? Okay. I don't think you'll get a question like that. I doubt so, right? Because that is an angle that I've added in. But in order to do this topic and EU, right, you still would need to know something about regionalism. So you can get an open-ended kind of question on regionalism, testing on anything about what are the characteristics associated with regional organizations. How are regional organizations different or similar, right, to international organizations, right? Then again, you would be able to bring in the logic of the English school, right, and the pen of fried eggs, right, to compare, to say that okay, this is how regional organizations look like. This is what structures their relationships vis-a-vis international organizations, or if you think that they're the same or not, right? What else you got? There was one more idea in my head. Then now I forgot what it was. Regional organizations in terms of like, for example, okay, like what I mentioned to you earlier on, right, about the organizing principle, right? So do regional organizations, cater or contribute to the development or the steadfastness of a particular organizing principle? Say, for example, in the European region, right, the organizing principle technically would be, say, cooperation, diplomacy, European values, and so on, right? Okay, ideals, right, democracy, okay, these kinds of ideas, right, the values, right? What about regional organizations in other regions, right? Does it contribute to a particular uh, um, organizing principle like what you see in Africa? So you would need to have that comparison. I would think that if you get a question specifically on regional organizations, regionalism, right? It could go two ways. One, it could go in a way that the question tells you, discuss, okay, I'm just giving you a rough framework, right? Discuss regional organizations, and then whatever specificity that the question wants you to, discuss, like discuss regional organizations in terms of how they contribute to cooperation, for example, right? And then you could get a question that says that, right? And says, in application to any region of your choice. If you get a question like that, then of course you could, and you are familiar with EU, then you could say that I choose to discuss this question, right, in the context of the EU, right? It could go that way, right? Or they could just say, discuss regional organizations in terms of XYZ specificity, right? If you get the latter, the second type, that means they do not say discuss regional organizations in a region of your choice. If they do not mention in a region of your choice, I would think, right, that that kind of question, because it's more open-ended, would actually require, or it will be better, right, if you focus your discussion on at least two regions. If they say of your choice, right, then you can just go ahead and say, I want to do EU, right, and then discuss European Union and so on, right? But if they don't leave it open to you, right, it may be a good idea to discuss at least two regions, or unless you come out specifically and say, I would like to focus my discussion. That means in your thesis statement and your introduction, you said it. sorry, sorry. You make it, a sorry, one second, Oh, cannot open. Okay. Sorry. Unless you make it specific in your introduction and you tell the marker, I want to discuss regionalism, right? And I am going to focus it specifically on, the European region. But how can you have, my opinion is that, how can you have a comprehensive discussion of regionalism, right, and regional organizations if you only look at one region only, correct? Especially if it's an open-ended question. So that's my logic. Of course, I'm not saying that that is wrong. If you are specific to the marker, it's specific in your exam answer, and you state that I want to focus my discussion on only this particular region, and this is what I want to explain, right? Then fine. I think that would be okay also. I cannot give you a guaranteed framework or an answer, right? Because I don't have access to that particular marking guide and the marking for that particular year, right? So I'm just giving you different ideas as to how you could use the the answers, use the information. And if you do get a question that is on regionalism like that, right? Then what I have done for you in this section, I mean, because it's an info overload, if I put it in the EU chapter, right? Okay, what I've done is I've given you a specific, section, a few slides, right, discussing regionalism per se. All right. So I want to draw your attention to this, okay? Because you could still use these ideas that I've mentioned here, right, to complement an argument that you craft on the EU if you're looking at it from the perspective of regionalism, right? When we looked at the EU chapters, all the three chapters, right, you realize that the focus was actually more on the logic of integration, cooperation, right? The problem children in the in terms of the EU member states, what are they happy about, what are they unhappy about, the logic of Euroscepticism, the logic of how the European Union basically has evolved over the years to become stronger, more institutionalized, how it has basically contributed to the development of the region to ensure that they do not revert to any kind of conflict, right, as an organizing principle. So that was basically the focus, right, the main focus, right, of the EU chapters. We did talk about integration. We did talk about regionalism in the sense that how it helps to foster, right, an identity within the region among all of its member states. But the focus wasn't so much per se on the idea of regionalism, right? So what I think I've done here, right, is to give you the idea of regionalism, right, which you can borrow some of the core concepts if you want to apply it to an argument on the EU with the focus on regional organizations or regionalism. So at least for that reason, I want to draw your attention to this part so that even if you are not intending to really do a question on the AU and the OAU, right, at least you have that this information on regionalism is here, right, in this chapter, and you can take a look at the notes, right, and complement it. Make it complementary to your discussion on the EU. You understand where I'm coming from? Okay, all right. So that is why I do not want I would not recommend skipping the topic altogether, right? Because there are you can still use it in whichever way. Like I always I've mentioned it before, I want to stress it again, right, since we're coming closer. I mean, this is like the last few chapters already. We do OAU, right, 17 and 18. Then we do ICTY ICTR 19. 20 would be ICC. 21 is basically summing up everything. So I got only a few more lectures with you before you go for your prelims, right? Okay, do you have any information on the way the prelim exams? No, so far no, right? Okay, yeah. I just wanted to double check. I asked the office this morning. They said that they are in the midst of preparing the info for all of us. All right, so you will get an email, I think, fairly soon regarding the prelim exams. Okay, all right. I'm not too sure whether it's open book or closed book. I think it should be open book, and then I think it should be online. I think it should be online. All right. Okay. But when I have any info, I will let you all know. Okay. All right. Anyway, what I was saying was that we got a couple more lectures left, right? So I wanted to point out to you these things. Remember, when you look at each of these topics, right? Don't X out the topic entirely. Look at which part of the topic you're familiar with or you're interested in. Like IMF, I always use IMF and World Bank as an example, right? IMF and World Bank, right? Which part are you interested in? If it was me, I'll be very interested in the structural adjustment programs, the institutional effect of the IMF. So, you may not like the discussion about the technicalities, right? The qualified majority voting or the weighted quotas and, how they arrive at these technical formulas and so on. That part may not be as appealing, to you as maybe a critique of the structural adjustment programs, right? Logic is this, right? Pick out certain things because you could get a question that's specifically on structural adjustment program. You would have wasted, the topic by just not revising it altogether, right? So always, look at it, take a more nuanced, approach to your revision also, right? Think about, which part can I use, which part is useful, which part am I interested in, which part is it easy for me to argue, right? How can I, fix things like together like a jigsaw puzzle and so on. That's the best way to approach, right? Otherwise, you'll end up, you say, I don't like this, I don't like that, I don't like this, I don't like that. Then you end up with what? 2 topics, 3 topics. Cannot go for exam with 3 topics or 4 topics. I've had students who do that and come back and tell me, I shouldn't have done that. Yeah, and I'm like, yeah, I told you like 500 million thousand times not to do that. And then you still want to do, then I cannot help you. Right? Okay, logic. Okay, so that is what I want to give you about the background. Those who came in a bit later, please do go back, watch the recording, because I mentioned the different categories of questions, right? How you could use this topic. All right. Okay. So if you came a little bit later, please make sure up to you lah. Please, but that's what I discussed. In the beginning of the discussion here. Okay, are we all clear on this one? Any questions? No? Okay. All right. Okay, I'm going to close this so that the screen looks bigger. All right. Okay. So I've given you, a couple of, links. Like I said, the first few ones, right? The geopolitical analysis and so on. That one would give you a little bit of, an overview or a background. Just watch it, when you're eating lunch or something, just to have an understanding of, what are the dynamics, right, within the African region and so on, right? That will just give you a bit of background. If the 2021 one to 2022. I couldn't find the same one, the Caspian analysis. They didn't update. So the more recent one, 2021, 2022, is a different channel, but it seemed quite okay, right, when I watched it. So that the logic is to just get if you're totally unfamiliar with the region. Anybody actually is familiar with the region, like you've done it in other courses? Generally, no, right? I only see one. No, no, right? Yeah. So but please don't be hesitant. It's not difficult, right? Say that for everything, right? But it really isn't difficult, all right? Okay. But just to enhance your understanding, right? You can take a look at the videos, right? So just watch it. And that's all. Also, don't have don't have okay, just a touch in IP about regionalism. Okay, all right, fine. Okay. So some of these things may be a little bit familiar to you lah. All right, if you've done regionalism in IPE, I presume lah. All right. Okay, but never mind. It's okay. It's all right. All right. We'll just deal with it. Okay. So oh, I was going to say something. Okay, never mind. It will come back to me later on. Okay, so I've given you some questions I pulled up from over the years, right? About questions on regionalism per se. So this is what I was trying to tell you just now, right? So that was what I wanted to mention. You could get a question, right, that uses the theories, like you see the 2018 one, right? Okay, this question here, the 2018. If the world really worked according to the principles of realism, there would be no place for international institutions, right? So you could get that kind of questions, basically. Okay, I want to remind y'all, remember, okay, sometimes in the exam, even though in the subject guide, they make a clear distinction between organization and institution, right? In the exam, I do notice, I do not know why this happens, right? And I have zero control over it. I do notice that they use the terms interchangeably, right? Chances are 90% of the time, when you get a question like that, the one, if the world really worked according to principles of realism, there would be no place for international institutions. The institutions, right, is actually referring to organization. Okay, 90% of the time, right? Very rarely are they going to ask you specifically about institutions per se, like rules of membership and rules of behavior, that institution. All right. So this is what we've been noticing. Just look at the question carefully. If there is a question like this and you really are unsure whether they're referring to institutions as in rules of membership and rules of behavior, practice, principles, and norms, right? Or you are not sure whether they're referring to organizations per se. If you really cannot decide on the spot, skip the question. Go to a different question. You've got 12 options, right? Okay. You can always choose another one. And this will apply to any question. The moment you look at a question, it may be your pet topic, but if there is a keyword in the question, if there is a quote, an opinion, if it's even a phrase that you are not sure what the meaning of this phrase is, how to interpret this phrase. The moment you have a doubt, don't second guess, right, yourself, and don't think that, okay, I think this is what it means. I'm just going to wing it. Don't take a risk. All right, I would recommend that be on the safer side, right? That is my advice to you, right? Okay, don't take a risk in the exam. Not worth it. Okay, the moment you're doubtful, already don't. Okay, but in this question here, I can tell you that this one is about organizations, right? So in this case, how do you use realism, liberalism, social constructivism, Marxism, and so on? Okay, Marxism we don't examine per se in this course, right? Yeah. Okay, but how do you use these kinds of theories to explain the relevance, importance of international organizations or regional organizations, right? Okay, so in the case of international organizations, how does realism apply? How does realism impact on even regional organizations and so on? Okay, so that would be a particular question. You look at the 2014 one, right? This question this is a sabotage kind of a question, right? Okay, because basically it says evaluate the extent to which any regional organization other than the EU, so don't give you any choice already, right? So you want to do this question, you've got to do something apart from the EU, right? That has promoted integration between its member states. So if you do that, if you get a question like that, how would you approach that question? Basically, the question would be to say, all right, you could still make reference to the EU. You could still make reference to the EU. How? By saying that, okay, other than the EU, right, the one other prominent, organization, right, that is dedicated to regional development that we have examined in this course, right, is OAU and AU, right? Then you go on to discuss, the contribution of the OAU and AU, and your opinion as to whether indeed it has promoted regional integration among the member states, right? Then you could bring in one paragraph also to say that, if you are looking at the OAU and the AU, right? Unfortunately, it has not reached the level of promoting integration among its member states in comparison to the EU, which is the original organization, right? Okay, so of course you wouldn't discuss EU in great detail in a question like that, but you could still use it as a reference point. You understand my point now here? But if that was the only question that was a regional organization, then you have to deal with it like that, right? 2017 discuss cooperation between the UN and the OAU with regards to intervention in any one crisis situation in Africa. This kind of question, if you do not have adequate background, you could have adequate background on Africa per se, but if you do not have adequate information on a specific crisis issue, right? Okay, then you cannot answer this question either. Correct? You understand what I mean? That means you have to be able to explain one specific crisis and one specific peacekeeping mission, right, in order to answer that kind of question. This kind of question, right, is extremely specific. Now you got to also think about exam strategy, right? Are you going to go for questions that are the very specific type of exam question? I put this up down here because I want to, get you to start thinking about these kinds of things also, right? How are you preparing for your exams? How are you preparing for your revision, right? Do you have a cursory discussion, right, and cursory knowledge, overview kind of a knowledge, kind of a discussion on the various, nuances and various ideas within each of these organizations, right? Or is it something that is very specific? Because you cannot answer this question if you do not have in-depth, detailed, right, and a case study on, a crisis situation in particular, right? So how are you, phrasing? How are you approaching your revision, right? In particular, for particular topics, right, there will be these kinds of questions, right? Particularly related, maybe you want to write this down, all right? Okay, particularly related to questions on UN. Notice this one is also UN, right? UN, right, and any organization that deals with security, right? You may have a scenario where they ask you, all right, discuss the impact of peacekeeping missions. Discuss the impact, right, of intervention discuss the impact of humanitarian aid or humanitarian intervention, and they ask you specifically to use one particular crisis scenario. So it could be, Syrian war. It could be Sudan. Whichever that you want to pick. Ivory Coast, right? Rwandan genocide. Any one of these, correct? All right, but you would need to have that chunk of information. This kind of question, you cannot give this, generic kind of answer, on, generally what crisis scenarios are and so on, and then refer to a couple because the question is very specific. I want you to examine one crisis scenario in particular, right? And if you do not have the requisite information and you just have like one measly diet paragraph, right? You probably will not fail. Probably will not fail. If I was a marker, I would fail you. Let's just be fair down here, okay? If I was a marker, I would fail you because I say you did not answer the question, right? Not because I'm strict, right? But because I am just going by the logic of did the script answer the question, right? And then that would go on to think about your grade, right? To what extent did he answer the question? What is the quality of the answer, right? So that would be how I would approach if I was a marker. You would do the same if you were marking also, right? Right? Did the script answer the question? Correct. So please, I point this out because I have seen prelim answers. I've seen prelim answers. I do not know whether because it is a prelim paper and students did not prepare adequately. I can't tell at this point, right? And students also will not say they will not admit back to me, lah, right? But when I have seen prelim papers, right, I see this kind of cursory, generic discussions for questions that are very specific. You cannot afford to do that. Okay. All right, so this is the exam tip part for you, right? Last question, 2019. Assess the contribution of the African Union to the settlement of disputes. Again, a very specific question. It does not ask you to assess the contribution of AU, right? To, as a regional organization, but with specific focus, right, to the settlement of disputes. And if you do not have, again, information or case study on at least two disputes, because the question says disputes, correct? So you need to refer to at least two disputes, right? Or at least, a couple. And if you're not, going to focus on, one or two disputes, then what you need to do is to have a list of a couple of disputes. Is there a dispute resolution mechanism? Why does not the dispute resolution mechanism work? Right? Is it because, what are the interferences? It's because states are wearing their realist lenses. So you bring in the theories, right? States wearing their realist lenses. The AU and the OAU is not, let me rephrase it. While you would expect regional organizations to represent the egg yolk in the pan of fried eggs. So you bring in the you bring in the regionalism and the Busan's logic from English school, right? So while you think that regional organizations are supposed to represent the egg yolk, right, in the theory of the pan of fried eggs, right, and should be able to contribute to the effective settlement of disputes, you do not see this same mechanism working well in the OAU and the AU because of XYZ reason, because states are wearing the realist lenses, because the organization per se is ineffective, right? Unfortunately, OAU in AU, right? In comparison to all the organizations we have examined so far and will examine subsequently in terms of the ICTY, ICTR, right? Not very effective. It's considered to be one of the least effective organizations, right? So it is toothless. It is not very effective, and therefore, dispute resolution mechanism doesn't work. And then there's this deadly cocktail. All right, I like to use this word. Right? This is deadly cocktail, right, or this lethal combination of states wearing their realist lenses plus, right, the organization per se also not being very effective. So these two put together, right, creates a scenario where you do not have high levels of success, right, in terms of dispute settlement, right? And what are the disputes about, right? If the dispute is about access to scarce resources, is the dispute in relation to spillover effects of conflict, that means you have intra-state conflict, civil conflict, right, which is a characteristic of weakened states, or failed states, right? States that are generally, when you look at states with poor governance, weak governance, particularly in in the African region, right? So, in terms of these weakened or these failed states, right? What kind of disputes, can arise? So, disputes over access of scarce resources, disputes over spillover effects, right? Of the intra-state conflict, right? So, like what happened in the case of Rwandan genocide, you had the Rwandan genocide, and in Rwanda, and then subsequently what you had, right, was the spillover effect in terms of the mass exodus from Rwanda into DRC, into Congo, right, and that dragged the conflict on over to that region there, right. So you could have a scenario such as that, right, or you could have a scenario of disputes arising as a result of states wearing their realist lenses and not cooperating within the regional organization in terms of economic deals and so on, right. So different kinds of disputes. So in the first place, even before you answer this question, you got to also explain to the marker, right, what kind of disputes arise in the region. Just like how you would talk about, say for example, if we talked about EU, right, and then you talk about the problems associated with Brexit, right. Then when you talk about the problems associated with Brexit and the future, of the EU, right? Then you would have to mention things like, like what we talked about, the delays, the new negotiations, the customs duties, and all of these things, correct? Right, associated with Brexit and what UK is facing today, correct? So you got to explain, again, what it disputes. A student that doesn't do well for this kind of question will be just dispute throughout the paper, but don't actually explain what kind of disputes are we referring to, right? That are prevalent in the region. You understand? So if you look at the questions, that come up for this topic, there's like a couple of nuances. One, either it's very specific, right? Right down to like refer to one specific crisis, right? Or it's very specific in terms of expecting you to explain what kind of disputes tend to arise in the region. It could be more generic, right, in terms of the regionalism kind of questions, right? So there is actually quite a lot of value, right, in looking at this topic, right? But approach it, according to your okay, that's what I'll say. Approach it according to your comfort level, right? So if you want to look at this topic, you want to prep, right? Prep, say for example, take out the parts of the regionalism, right? If you are the type that is very interested in disputes, in crisis scenarios, intrastate conflict, and so on, and you have knowledge of that, you have knowledge of peacekeeping missions, then go for that angle, right? But nuance it yourself and choose. Cannot emphasize this enough. Choose your question carefully. All right. Okay. Number two, this one. Okay, this one was a piece of advice from a student who did extremely well in political science, right? Past student, right? Did extremely well, topper for intro to political science, and then did this course subsequently, didn't do that great. Came back to me and told me, he said, tell your subsequent classes, don't take the same risk that I did, right? He wrote an answer that was whatever answers that he wrote, right, was entirely theory based. That meaning he did not make use of any specific case studies in the paper. He passed, right? He passed okay, didn't do very well, right? So think about this, right? You cannot have answers to questions in this topic that are entirely theory based. You must have some kind of case study, some kind of examples, right? I cannot emphasize this enough, because I do see students who write answers like this. I also see students who write an entire answer, say for example, on NATO or on EU, just like a story, like as if they're just using case studies and examples alone. Also cannot do that, right? So you need to have a balance. Okay, I mention all of this right now because since we're talking about exam questions, right, and we're nearing the revision period already. Please think about all of these things as you're prepping for the material. This course is not an easy course. I'm sorry, right? Okay, it really isn't an easy course, right? But again, none of the courses are easy lah, right? It's not just this one, right? Yeah, all right. But it's really not an easy course, so I would advise you spend a little bit of time to think about your exam strategy, right? It's not so straightforward like intro to political science, where very nicely one question, one topic, right? Okay, this one like more or less okay, one question, one topic, but still, right, there are things that you need to think about in terms of the angle of the question. Okay, all right, are we all clear on the kinds of questions and the logic and everything? Okay, all right. I'm still trying to finish earlier, right? Like what I mentioned just now. Okay. All right. Let's look at. Okay. Let me do this. Right. We have a bit of time. First. So let's go for the lunch break maybe a little bit later. Right. And that means I'll push it a little bit. Let me finish the entire discussion on regionalism. Then we go on to the lunch break. Then we do the background. All right. Then we can have that discussion. Right. I think today's material quite easy to digest. Right. Okay. I just want to like I said, I won't go through every single slide, right? But explain the more important issues to you. Okay. All right. When you look at regionalism, okay, what you want to start off. That means when you start off your discussion, regardless of whether your question requires you to talk about, the EU or not, right, or the European region or not, I would still think, right, that you want to bring up the idea of how regionalism and the success of regional organization, which is the EU, right? Remember, the EU is special, right? It can be classified as both international organization as well as a regional organization. Okay. All right. But what you would say is that European developments basically were a positive influence, right, on the creation of regional organizations, right? So basically, what you could say is that number one, right, it represents the rationale about how different disparate states, right? That means distinct states, disparate, disparate, right? Distinct states with different capacities, different interests, right, can come together. That means it is, an experiment that is successful in that sense, right? Okay. So, that is, one issue, right? That highlights to the rest of the world. The other one, right, is that it represents this logic, a result over fears that a more integrated Europe would lead to declines in trade between Europe and other countries, right? So the rationale is that if you see, increasingly powerful bloc like what you see in Europe, right? How are other states going to go head on head, right? Not head on head, what am I saying? Go head on, head on head. Go head on, one on one, one on one. That was what I meant to say, right? Head on or one on one. That means one individual small state attempting to compete, right, against or compete with, the developments in Europe per se, right? So in that case, if you've got a powerful bloc, then a bloc to bloc interaction may actually be favorable, right? So that's the rationale down here, right? So a more integrated Europe would lead to declines in trade between Europe and other countries because the other issue is this, right? If Europe is so integrated, then basically they have each other within the European bloc to rely on as well. So if that's the case, right, then the third aspect is that they Europe per se doesn't need technically to seek out economic, political, diplomatic relationships with those outside the bloc, right? That would be the fear, right? So in that case, how then would the other states survive or compete against it, right? So in that case, they also would need to contribute. They also would need to create a regional organization or a bloc, right, in order to compete effectively or in order to progress themselves, right? So there are different ways to understand what are the influences, right, that regionalism, right, and regional integration in Europe may have had on the development of regional trends elsewhere, right? So you can start off the discussion by saying this is what regionalism in the European region looks like. How does that inspire, influence, color, right, trends in regional developments elsewhere, right? So that could be your starting point. Okay. Regionalism could also be seen as an impact a response to the impact of globalization, right? Okay, so you can maybe you want to write this down here, right? You can link this to the logic of the English school, right? Okay, so the rationale is that globalization, right, is the thinner the thinner relationships among states, when you talk about the pan of fried eggs, right? When I refer to English school in this case, right, I'm more or less referring to two things. Number one, when I say English school, I'm talking about the logic of that particular international society. Because in English school, we always refer to the logic of states, right, as particular society. So European International Society, American International Society, African International Society, right? So first logic when I refer to European school, English school, right, is the specific international society. Second thing, when I refer to English school, you should zoom in to the idea of the pan of fried eggs. Okay, so these are the two things when I say English goal for this chapter, right, that I'm making reference to. Okay. All right. So when you see regionalism as a response, to increasing impact of globalization, what does globalization represent? Right. Okay. So the idea of weakening or threatening national or regional identities, right, because of the logic of being swept up, right, swept up in this logic of interdependence, integration, right? The logic of global village, right? The lowering of barriers to entry, right? You've got the basically what's your definition of globalization, right? Movement of people, labor, capital, increase in communications, right? Increase in trade. And what do all of these require? It requires a lowering of the barriers to entry, correct? Right? So that's the rationale down here. So sometimes when you discuss globalization, right, not sometimes, in fact, most authors when they discuss globalization, what do they always talk about? They talk about the weakening of the state. Isn't that how basically they look at it, right? The weakening of the state or the rolling back of the state, right? The state now plays an increasingly smaller role, right, vis-a-vis the role that it used to play before. The rise of the non-state actors, right? And then of course, when you talk about this, of course, you wouldn't say that today the state indeed remains as an actor that plays a minimal role in international relations. Why? Because all of the different crises that we've witnessed over the years, right, the economic crises and so on, have prompted the state to like the rise of the Leviathan all over again, right? Because of it left to its own devices, the market, when it self-regulates, right, it creates the scenarios like what we saw 997 997 Asian financial crisis, 2008 hedge fund crisis, or 1970s what's that, the great inflation and so on and so forth, right? Okay, but still you're looking at the logic where globalization threatens your traditional, national, regional, and identities, right? Because it weakens power, sometimes legitimacy of the state, right? Because it undermines the role that the state plays in terms of providing various collective goods, right? Because you've got the non-state actors like businesses, MNCs, NGOs, IOs, who now also play increasingly large roles, right? Also, you want to think about the logic of security against external threats, right? So the logic, if you are part of a regional grouping, right, and you are affected by this logic of weakened legitimacy, weakened identities, and so on, right, then you would see regional organizations as being like a bulwark, BULWARK, right? That's a nice word to use, right? Or just say value in being part of a regional grouping. Bulwark, BULWARK. All right. Okay. I think that's how you pronounce it. Value in being part of a regional grouping, right? That may act as a bulwark against such threats. Okay. All right. So that is something that you want to mention also. Just like how you would say like individual European states, right? Vis-a-vis once they have gained membership in the European Union, right? How they see the European Union as number one, an endorsement of particular characteristics or values that they represent or that they have. So just like how having a seat in the UN General Assembly is a representation of a state, being a sovereign state, a de jure state, right, as opposed to a de facto state, right? Same thing, being a member, being accepted, right, as a member technically means being accepted as a member of a regional organization, right, or international organization technically means that you've met the qualifying criterion, right? There's specific criterion that means your economy is sound, you've got a stable government, for example. I'm just giving you random examples, right? So you've met these basic characteristics or requirements in order to be part of a regional organization or international organization, right? So that is also a reason why you may have states who see when you talk about security against external threats, right? How do you understand this logic of security against external threats, right? It's not just the traditional notion of what security actually means, right? But what kind of an identity does it provide, right? So security means if I'm part of the regional organization, that means I am an accepted member of this international of this region, right? I am a member of this international community or this regional community, which means, right, I have met particular criteria. My economy is stable, or I have got sound economic practices, X, Y, Z, and so on. Okay. Okay, so that is the first part where you want to discuss it. Then you've got when you talk about the response to globalization, right? You've got two trends that you can think about, right? So one is defensive, right? Okay, a defensive response, and the other one is a conferring, enhanced bargaining power. So look at the first one, right? Very simple, right? Regionalism as a way of emphasizing protecting local cultures and enterprise, right? So basically, the logic is that if you think about it in terms of protectionist impulses, right? Okay, so when you look at regionalism, right? First wave driven by government's bureaucracies. Second wave is actually more bottom up, like a grassroots kind of a movement, right? From various actors or various local interest groups that basically are seeking, right, protection, seeking a shield against various external influences like external competition, right? And the other rationale also is that governments use regionalism to maintain authority, right? So that means they refer or they sorry not they refer they defer, DEFER, they defer to, right, the practices, the principles, the norms that are espoused by the regional organizations, right? That means it's like similar idea. If there's a dispute, right, or there is something that needs to be settled, right, between two states in terms of say a trade dispute, right, or does this law particularly apply? How do we interpret this law? Then you look towards the regional organization, right, to be like a mediating party, or like what we saw in the case of the EU, right, and the effect of the direct effect of the law, right, refer back to the regional organization, right, to say that how do you interpret this particular law, how does it apply, and so on, like a neutral party, for instance, right? So that's where you've got the idea of using regionalism to maintain authority, because it's an interpretation of particular laws, particular norms, practices, and principles, right? So that is, the first trend that you can think about. The other one is conferring enhanced bargaining power in global negotiations. And very straightforward. You know exactly what it refers to. Basically, strength in numbers, lah, right? Okay. So and also providing a secure opportunity for commercial amalgamations to take place, right? In terms of again, same logic, strength in numbers, right? But you have the rationale where there are more opportunities, there are more ways to basically interact with other members external to that region, right? And the ability to participate in global markets are very important today, because that is where you see a lot of interaction among various states, right? You in particular, you see, when you talk about globalization, you talk about economic interdependence and so on. Global markets are where majority of the action basically takes place, right? Okay, so that's where you will find that why regionalism is basically important, right? So these 2 points and what we mentioned in the first slide, right? All of this is going towards discussing what the positive impact of regional organizations, or the positive impact of regionalism. That means why? That means if you get a question that asks you the importance or relevance of regional organizations, then you would use these kinds of arguments to say this is why, right, regional organizations become important, because regional organizations rely on these kinds of mechanisms, right? You understand how to make that connection between these arguments here, and regional organizations per se. Okay, all right. Then you also have the logic of the breakdown of your traditional socialist and your third world ideologies. I do not like that phrase, third world. I usually like to use developing country, or developing world, global south, and so on, right? Okay, but basically the idea of how regionalism basically helps to even out the capacities, right, of states when they are all attempting to transit from more traditional structures, more closed economy structures, right, and attempting to open up their economies or restructure their economies according to neoliberal economic doctrines, right? So you have this logic of neoliberal economic policies, right, that may be applicable to several different states at the same time, instead of one state attempting to open up its economy and then facing stumbling blocks and so on, right? And what is the point of only one state within that region or a couple of states within that region opening up their economies and attempting to implement neoliberal economic policies or doctrines when the other states that you tend to trade with and interact with are not doing so as well, right? Okay. All right. This video is quite interesting to watch. Take a look at this one. Right. It's a bit theory based, right? But helps you to, it helps to clear certain things, related to, regionalism. Right. Okay. So when you talk about, regional organizations or regionalism, right? Okay. These are some of the questions, right? Wait. I want to. I forgot to mention one thing, right? This here, right? Remember I mentioned. Sorry, go back to the previous slide. Right. This one when I mentioned, the logic about the neoliberal economic doctrines, right? The other thing that you want to mention also is that it makes it easier for governments to convince, right, the political parties or the actors within the states, right, of embracing neoliberal economic doctrines, because it's like it's not just us, it's other states are also doing so. If we want to take advantage of the developments, economic or political developments that will subsequently arise, right? Then it's best that we also embrace neoliberal economic doctrines. This one will be useful in the sense that if you have resistance, all right, among interest groups, resistance among political parties, domestic actors, civil society groups, or citizens in general who are concerned about what neoliberal economic policies can do if they have been consistently exposed to protectionist doctrines, right? So the shift, right, may sometimes cause resistance or inertia among the bureaucracy or among political parties and so on, right? So this structural adjustment, right, that is being promoted, it may be easier for the governments to do so, right, if it's taken if it takes place within a regional context, right? Okay, so that's what I want to mention here. Okay, sorry, I forgot to mention it. Okay, let's come to this one down here. All right, when you talk about regionalism, right? Just now, the first few slides was telling you about what are the intended outcomes, right? That means what can basically what are the positive aspects that you can glean out of regionalism, right? When you discuss regionalism, right, you also want to think about these questions down here, right? It means when you want to assess, if you get a question that requires you to talk about the assessment, right, of regionalism, right, what you would need to think about, right, is these kind of questions. Will regionalism promote welfare of the majority of people in participating countries? Meaning, right, is it just, I don't like this word, but I'm going to use it anyway. Is it just talk shop, right? Is it just like a talking club of heads, right? Talk, 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 talk. Like we will do this, we will do that. We, by 2050, we aim to do X, Y, Z. We have got these grand, lofty ambitions and so on, right? And then nothing comes out of it, right? So, really, when you talk about regionalism, does it promote the welfare, of the majority of the people, right? Okay. So one is talk shop. Two, related to this, right, is that the positive effects of regionalism. That means anything that can be associated with, say, maybe an increase in economic development, a rise in growth, GDP levels, a rise in revenue as a result of selling off natural resources, engaging in trade, and so on. Does this contribute to the welfare of the citizens? Is there redistribution of the effects of the growth, right, of the region back to the citizens? That is the first question you need to ask, right? Okay. Basically, is there a trickle down effect, right? Okay. That's the first thing that you need to ask, right? Otherwise, what is the point of regionalism? Correct? If you're talking about, say, regional organizations, contribute to growth, they contribute to economic progress, they contribute to development. Who is experiencing this economic growth, progress, and development? Is this lining the pockets of the elites? Is it going towards the coffers of kleptocratic states? Right? And why does this happen? If it does happen, why does it happen? Is it because regionalism has done nothing, right, to actually address the kleptocratic nature of states? Has not done anything to address weak institutions or poor governance, right, that exists among states within that region. And unfortunately, stereotypically, states in Africa are known, right, to in many states, not all, right? Okay, let's not be stereotypical, all right, and let's not box ourselves into a corner. So you say, many states in Africa, right, are generally known to have, structures that embody poor governance or weak governance, weak institutions, unable to provide public goods and services for to their citizens, and so on. And has this scenario just continued to perpetuate during, right, perpetuate despite, not during, despite being part of regional organizations. That means regional organizations or regionalism has not contributed to the betterment, right, of governance structures, and has not contributed therefore to the betterment of the welfare of the people, right? Okay, so that is when you talk about what is the impact, right? Does it promote regional security? Look at organizations that contribute to society, to security within a particular grouping of states, like what you see in NATO. Generally, all right, it's not a regional organization per se, but it's more of an international organization. But it is an effective contributor, right, to defense within the European region, all right, European region in general, right? Or the EU, for instance, right? So, what is the meaning of security? Number one. Number two, right? If you're looking at, the hard notions of what security refers to, does, whatever regional organization you're looking at, does it, contribute to security, right? And this is actually quite significant if you're looking at it in terms of, the African region in particular. Remember what I told you, the characteristics of, what you see in Africa, right? Civil conflict, intra-state war, right? Or intrastate conflict, right? Okay. So, critical in 21st century thinking, 21st century politics, thinking about things like scarce resources, thinking about things like power vacuums, right? Instability when you have transition from one government to another government, right? And, in Africa, another trend that you see, have you heard of this phrase? Third termism. Have you heard of this phrase before? Third termism. Third termism, right? Where you've got, okay, let me be very blunt, right? When you've got, political parties and politicians, right, who are like 70, 80, 90 years old, running for elections all over again, refusing to step down, even if they lose, refusing to give way to new blood, right? There's, many videos on the logic of third third termism. Third termism. Let me write it in the chat. Hold on, so you can go and Google this if you like. Wait, third termism. Okay, that one. Okay, all right. You do see it, in Africa. Of course, there's a whole lot more to it, than what I basically, explained in a very blunt layman way, right? Okay, but that logic down there. So, economic recession, civil conflicts abound, right? So this interconnectedness of economies and so on, right? The logic of, your doorstep is his backyard, right? So the level of integration that regionalism promotes, and therefore, does it work to create better regional security, right? Or does it actually increase instability, for all states as a result of these characteristics? If you apply this logic to, say, for example, EU, right? Does it promote regional security? Answer likely will be yes, right? If you look at, scenario where there is a lot of instability, a lot of intrastate conflict, a lot of fighting over access to already scarce resources, then you have got the added impact of things, like environmental degradation, and you've got things like, gender inequalities, low level of resources, weak governance, and all of these things, right? Climate change and so on. Then, does that, compound the problems associated with states and economies that are very closely integrated with each other, right? So that means interdependence can go, the logic here is to have an open mind. When we talk about interdependence, all of us, right? Technically, when we talk about interdependence, we always zoom in to one angle to say that interdependence is good. And why is it good? Because it promotes integration. It allows consensus building. It allows states to tap onto the benefits of cooperation. I can tap into your capacity. I can learn from you best practices. The idea of policy diffusion and so on, right? But does interdependence always result in a positive outcome or a positive consequence, right? If the entire region is plagued, right, by instability, it's plagued by civil conflict, if it's plagued by all of these different problems, then interdependence can also create negative outcomes, right? Or it can exacerbate, negative outcomes. It can exacerbate instability and so on. Correct? You understand the logic down here, right? So don't take a stereotypical view of what interdependence basically refers to, right? Okay, think about how it applies to that particular context. Remember, right down there, the importance of the political and policy context, associated, with all of these ideas down here. How does the political and policy context, the trajectory of the region, the inherent characteristics, the inherent vulnerabilities of that particular region or states within that region affect the way, right, these structures actually perform, right? And what are the outcomes associated with it? Okay, all right, we clear on this one? Okay, sometimes I mention this because it's our habit to basically look at certain things in a particular way. We need to break out of this habit. Third point down here: will it harmonize or work against, right, multilateral trade liberalization, right? So basically, multilateral trade liberalization is seen, right, as something that is crucial to improvements, to economic welfare, right? But the question really is, right, are states really still wearing their realist lenses to the point where they still stubbornly prefer bilateral or plurilateral trade relations because of the perceived advantage that they think, right, will come out of bilateral or plurilateral trade negotiations or trade relations. Bilateral, two states negotiating with each other, right? Plurilateral is smaller groupings of states, right? More than two, right? But still less than what multilateral trade relations or negotiations represent, right? So regional organizations, international organizations is towards the idea of multilateralism, right? But do states still, stubbornly prefer, right, this logic of bilateral or plurilateral trade negotiations because of these perceptions that they have? Right? Okay. So, are they, what kind of agendas do they have, right? And are these agendas, right, informed by, obviously, realist perspective, right? Or if you take the social constructivist approach to this entire argument, right? Remember, when you talk about social constructivism, right, what is the key gist behind it? How do states approach, interacting in that region? How do states approach interacting in that region or interacting in that environment, right? Their identities are not structured, right, or not, placed in cement, right? Their identities evolve along their political context. Remember, that's what social constructivism is about. The rationale is that, when a state is looking at an environment, it looks at it and says, is this environment full of opportunities to cooperate, or is this environment full of hostilities? If it is full of opportunities to cooperate, right, then I would choose to engage in cooperation. It is, I would respond in a liberalist manner, right? If it is full of hostilities, right, and full of enemies, full of instability, then I would choose to respond in a what? In a realist manner. I would rely on myself. Self-help, right? I will ensure that, relying on, I rely on self-help to ensure my survival, correct? So states who are in these regional groupings, right, may also take this perspective. When they look at the region and they look at the other actors that they are in interaction with, right? We look at these other actors. Are these other actors also wearing their realist lenses? Are these other actors also aggressive? Are these other actors also pursuing a particular agenda, right, in line with their own national interests, right? Is there a high level of instability within the region? And therefore, right, I do not find it, even though I'm in a regional organization, I do not find it so useful to respond in a truly liberalist manner, let down my guard, and, attempt to, have cooperative relationships with other states. Correct. Right, that's the rationale down here. So you can even apply the logic of social constructivism, to this argument down here. It's just about pulling things together. What I mean, these doesn't the argument make sense, right? So the rationale is that your answer may be different from someone else's answer, but you are using particular theories, right, or particular rationale to justify how you craft this answer. That is what is important down here. Okay. All right. And of course, if I was the marker and I look at your arguments, I would say, okay, the student has sat down and thought about all of these different ideas, pulling together all of these different ideas, using the theories, right, and applying it to this concept of regionalism. I would be impressed, right? And I would, think about, how I could, push you to another great band, if need be, right? Okay. All right. Let me see how many more I have on regionalism. I think this should be the last. Okay. Let's just do this one, and then after that we will go for the lunch break. Okay. All right. So then what you look at, when you think about regionalism is features of new regionalism, right? So what if you look at a regional organization or you look at the logic of regionalism, this is what you technically should be expecting: characteristics or features, right? This is not difficult to remember. Why? Because these are ideas that you technically are already exposed to when you looked at the EU, right? Because you looked at the logic of free trade areas, right? Customs union, external tariff, right? The rationale is that internally you lower your barriers to entry, but you have external tariffs for actors outside of the region. Movement of labor, movement of people, right? You've got, obviously, in all regions, you're going to see uneven capacities. This is like this is like an inherent characteristic, right? You're going to see blocks of, both highly developed states as well as, poorer producers. So you've got a mix of core, semi-peripheral, and peripheral states. If you take the world systems theory approach, to look at characterizing or categorizing states, right, or difficult to say global north versus global south within the region, right? So I would go with core or peripheral and semi-peripheral states, or you would go with richer and poorer states. That would be the easier categorization, right? You would have a rationale of do you see multilateralism, right, or do you see more protectionism as a block? All right. Okay. And the rationale about security communities, borrow the idea from NATO, right? What are the values, right, that this region embody, right? Does it represent a particular value? Does it represent a particular ideal, right? And of course, open borders to legitimate business transaction, or to criminals, right? You can go both ways also, right? Does the region promote or enhance, the movement of, say, illegal transactions, right? For example, like Hawala and so on. Okay. All right. So, of course, some of these are more prominent or more institutionalized in particular regions, right, as opposed to other regions. Say, for example, right, EU would see more of these like free trade areas, customs union, movement of labor, and so on, right, highly institutionalized. Vis-a-vis, some other regions, say, like, for example, in ASEAN or Southeast Asia or East Asia and the Pacific, and Africa, where you would say, like, the blocks of highly developed states versus poorer producers, right? So different regions may have certain characteristics that are enhanced, right? Or more prominent, not enhanced, sorry, wrong word. More prominent, that's the word I want to use, right? So, some of these are more institutionalized or more prominent, right, in particular regions, right? Okay, so that is, what you may actually be looking at. Take a look at, okay, this one, please write down. Okay, take a look at Kant's Means and Styles, chapter 5, right? Especially page 161 to 169. Kant's Means and Styles, right? Chapter 5, page 161 to 169, right? Okay, that one refers to the political ideas, right, driving regionalism. So things like, what drives regionalism? Power dynamics, identity, ideology, right? The presence of internal, external threats, right? Or anything related to domestic politics, leadership, economic factors, right? These are themes. Let me repeat that. I mean, I think I said it a bit fast. Specifically, they look at power dynamics, identity, ideology, internal, external threats, domestic politics, leadership. Even if you don't, go into in depth, right? And look at Kant's Means and Styles in terms of the content, right? These would still be themes, right? I always like to look at themes, right? Especially for level 2 courses, right? This is a more, a surefire way of introducing analysis into your arguments. So you've got, like say for example, what is the identity, or the values of that region, right? Or like, what the phrase I was using from the beginning of the discussion, organizing principle, right? Okay, right? Okay, so that's what you can pay attention to. Okay, then we will look at Barry Buzan and the Pan of Fried Eggs, right? This one is just like a recap for some of you. I'm not going to run through every single idea, right, for you to read. I will just run through very simply. Let's do this. I think everybody needs a defrost, right? So go for the lunch break. Okay. All right. What time is it? 1:26. What's 15 minutes from now? 35, 40, 40 something lah. 41, 42 lah. Then come back. Okay. All right. Break.